Thank you. I'm now shaking in my boots. So good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. Okay. Very good, guys. So first, I just wanted to thank the Kathy and the entire team, as well as Kristen and Emilio. It's just a real pleasure to be here, and to all of you. It's just a delight to be here in a nice setting. I almost feel like this is, in the architect who built this beautiful space, this is what they imagined. Research being presented in front of a small group of engaged people, except they didn't say that the macroeconomy was going to go down, so they were hoping more on the spaceships. Okay. So I'm Scott Stern. I do a lot of work around the economics of innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm also, among other roles, the faculty director at the Trust Center, which I know many of you engaged with through, and know Bill Ollett there. As well, I'm the faculty director of a program called the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program that actually this is I'm going to talk about. And in fact, this entire body of research I'm going to talk about kind of came out of the project of actually working with entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. So let me start, and let me just make sure I understand my timer. So let's go back 40 years. A few of you here, I'm not going to name names, might remember this kind of environment. This is what Kendall Square looked like in the late 1970s. They used to keep the snow, right? Boston would pay Cambridge to put the snow there, right? Right over there. That's what this looks like today. Just exactly, almost the exact same photograph. And one of the interesting things about that transformation, that just absolutely almost, kind of one of the most transformative pieces of economic development, not just in Massachusetts or not, right, in the world, right, is it's not like what happened was some one big company showed up and just, bought, they had one big factory and they just made the whole thing. In fact, what this reflected, right, some of you might remember this era, right, Lotus, right, and then Biogen kind of coming in Kendall Square and Akamai and others. But then, right, these other wave of startups, other entrepreneurs, many coming from MIT, whether or not that's PillPack or HubSpot or a little company called Moderna. That's why we're able to sit here tonight, right? Right? Some of you might know this one, actually, Commonwealth. How many of you have heard of Commonwealth Fusion Systems? Yeah, that's right. There's going to be a big announcement, as some of you might have heard tomorrow, from Lawrence Livermore, but CFS is really moving forward, and they just opened their facility today. But right in our neighborhood are people who are literally trying to transform the power of the sun in a startup, right? And it's not surprising that lots of people see that transformation. They come from around the world, and they're like, we want more of that. They go to Silicon Valley, they come here, they go to Israel, and they're like, we want that here, in our region. This is Josh Lerner. He did a great study about a little bit more than a decade ago, and he went and actually looked at efforts to promote entrepreneurship in regions around the world. And I love Josh. He's a great collaborator and friend, but he's kind of a grumpy guy. You can see it right there in the title, The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Right? A lot of these efforts weren't as successful as people had hoped. And they were by and large well-intentioned. They just weren't delivering on what people were hoping. And that was actually a prompt to myself, to Fiona Murray, to Bill Ollett, to a group of faculty and staff at MIT to found something called the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, where we've now had the opportunity to really bring kind of data and a systematic approach, a kind of almost root cause analysis, working with stakeholder teams around the world to actually understand how to drive and accelerate innovation-driven entrepreneurship. Okay? We're actually in our 10th year at REAP, and we had the opportunity to now work with more than 80 regions throughout the world. One of the kind of key insights of REAP is that something that economists sort of knew, but I think wasn't kind of commonly understood, was that actually when you go to most government agencies or even kind of universities or just how people were thinking about entrepreneurship, they were mostly talking about these small and medium-sized enterprises, right? Which are, in fact, super important, as we found out in the pandemic, to our economies, but are not the kinds of companies that really transform regions in the way that we describe, those innovation-driven enterprises, right? The second thing we learned about, right, so the question is, how can you make more of these IDEs? And who was responsible for that in any given region? And guess what we found? No one's in charge. No one is in charge of entrepreneurship. There's actually lots of consequences. I'm going to tell this story very, very quickly. We were in Singapore, and we went to the government-approved accelerator. Tim, are you happy with this one? Where's Tim? Right? There's nothing there. Well, it's beautiful. It had all the right facilities. It had a very good coffee machine, I promise you. There were just no entrepreneurs. We then went around the corner, and there was this buzzing accelerator that the entrepreneurs had actually developed themselves. It turned out that heading the government of Singapore to focus a little bit more squarely on actually listening to entrepreneurs, those innovation-driven entrepreneurs in Singapore, actually was able to actually better serve that system in a meaningful way. So one of the things we learned, right, very quickly was that stakeholders matter, that universities matter, corporates matter, risk capital matters, government matters, but of course, entrepreneurs and innovators matter. But that very often they were talking past each other. They couldn't even have a shared understanding. And so one of the things we did was we said, oh, maybe we could really start to develop metrics that were actionable, that would help people understand their ecosystems in real time. I usually thought that was going to be actually a very easy project. I figured like somebody had already done that. And so I posed that question to Jorge Guzman, who actually was a PhD student at the time. And Jorge came back to me and said, no, that work actually hasn't been done. But then Jorge is really, really good, excellent PhD student. He's now at Columbia Business School. And he and I, along with a group of collaborators, worked on basically developed something called the Startup Cartography Project. And so the basic insight that came out of Jorge's dissertation was that if we're trying to kind of get at the measurement, the systematically understanding how these ecosystems evolve, we have to be able to count businesses not just by their quantity, but by their potential for growth at the time of founding. We need to be able to predict companies with tremendous opportunities to grow. Well, how could you do that? Well, the first thing is that in fact, all businesses that ultimately grow register their business. And that's a very public fact. So you don't need special access to government data. It's like you can just go to the Secretary of State of any state, you can download the data. The second was that companies that are trying to grow, say Commonwealth Fusion Systems, that might work or not, but they've done a whole bunch of things at founding that indicate they're trying to grow. Do you see what I'm saying? They register Delaware, they have lots of patents, they're named Commonwealth Fusion. You usually don't have your name in Fusion unless you're trying to do something pretty big, right? And then the companies that actually succeed, say in Amazon, right, that did do different things at founding, we of course can observe them because they have these very big growth outcomes. They either have lots of employees or they have a big equity outcome, whatever it might be. Everyone so far so good? Okay. And so what we did is we then looked at every single business in the United States. So this is across 40 million businesses over about a 25-year period. And we looked at what was the probability that you grow as a function of these kind of things we can observe about you right when you get founded. Okay? Now, just to be clear, not causal. So Amelia was very good with the causality. Okay? This is a predictive analytics model. But all I'm trying to do is measure something here. I want to be able to predict. So if you name your firm, if it's Scott's Pizza, that's some dude named Scott trying to sell some pizza. Growth would be Scott's Pizza 2 for my wayward brother. Okay? Less likely to grow, 70%. Firms that register in Delaware, some of you might have seen some news about the Delaware Chancery Court vis-a-vis Elon Musk in the last 6 months or so. That registering in Delaware is a real thing. It shows that you're the kind of firm that wants access to kind of more systematic corporate law. And if you apply for or acquire a patent in your 6 months, you're literally 8,300% more likely to grow. Now, once you have, and once again, not causal, it's kind of the kind of firm, that's who we're trying to kind of pick the needles out of the haystack. So what that allowed us then to do was actually develop a new class of statistics for looking at how to measure entrepreneurship at an arbitrary timescale and an arbitrary level of granularity. And so just to give you a kind of sense of that, remember I showed you this picture before. I'm going to show you that picture in real time. So this is literally every business. So there we are right here. Okay, you're right there right now, right? This is, many of you will remember these years at some point, okay, different ones, right? And the size of each bubble is the number of firms founded. The color of the bubble, when you get each layer of kind of darker, is a 10 times increase in the probability that you grow. And where was Tim again? Tim Rowe. So maybe he left. Okay. And so what you can see is many of you have gone drinking here, right? Many, right? But then when we saw this over here, right? Kendall Square, the Cambridge Innovation Center, this is kind of like that evidence for actually seeing the emergence of that entrepreneurial ecosystem over time. Everyone so far so good? Okay. So now that so this was almost, remember, we knew this was kind of true. It helps us see it in a very visual way and to bring out the really kind of the dynamics of it, right? But then we were able to use it to actually kind of look at some big questions about what was happening in entrepreneurship in the United States. So for example, some of you, and in fact this feeds into kind of the work that kind of people like Kristen think about, over the past 25 years, do you think entrepreneurship has gone up or down in the United States? What do you think? Who says up? Good fraction of you. Okay, about half of you. How many people say entrepreneurship has gone down? Oh, a few of you, right? Okay. So it turns out that the quantity of entrepreneurship has actually been on a decline for a pretty long time, at least until the pandemic. The number of new businesses. But using this method, we were able to clarify that once you control for quality, once you control for growth orientation, actually it kind of goes up and down. There really was a there really was a dot-com boom. It kind of went down to a lower, but then it kind of came back up, right? And that actually was very different than the past. So there was once you controlled for the growth orientation of entrepreneurship, you see a very different picture than just looking at quantity. We then said, okay, we now have this good measurement tool, right? So far, remember I said it was predictive, but now that we have this measurement tool, maybe we can use it to answer kind of causal type questions. So this is with a collaborator, Valentina Tartari. This is looking at, do universities encourage entrepreneurship? Does more research at MIT or other research universities, does that help entrepreneurship? Actually, a very modest effect on the quantity. It just turns out national labs not so good. But when you get an extra kind of, there's a bunch of econometrics behind this, but think of it as kind of an extra new research grant to the university, what you see is actually a quite big rise in the quality-adjusted quantity of entrepreneurship in the region around that university in the subsequent 5 years. Okay? Similarly, this looked at the impact of, for example, the adoption of the R&D tax credit at the state level was able to kind of show the kind of long-term impact of that policy on, once again, not so much on quantity, but growth-oriented, innovation-driven entrepreneurship. Okay. Finally, one of the interesting things, this is once again just kind of association, but I just want to highlight it, is actually if you look at do places with more entrepreneurship, right? This is a group I'm pretty sure pro-entrepreneurship by and large. But actually, you see more entrepreneurship, you don't necessarily grow over the next decade as a region. Except when you account for quality. Then there's actually a pretty significant positive association. Once again, that doesn't mean, how do you get that growth-oriented entrepreneurship? That's the causal part. Those are the institutions and policies that build the kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems that we work with within the REAP program. I'm down to 0 time, so I'm going to not. Interestingly, I will tell about one quantity-oriented project, because there was a boom in entrepreneurship during the pandemic. We worked with the New York Times to kind of actually trace out that boom. And actually, it's not the usual suspects. There's a big increase, actually, in entrepreneurship in black neighborhoods during the pandemic that's now been persistent for 3 or 4 years, or basically 3 years. So actually a big, big effect that was actually kind of cool across many, many regions. Last, let me just bring this back into my minus last 30 seconds, which is to say, you know from your time at MIT that we take a lot of time working within our own ecosystem. Many of you are tremendous contributors. People like Gene Hammond, who is here. I'm not sure where Gene is. Gene? There you are. Right, right. Has been extremely supportive of this kind of work. And the question is, how do we build this? How do we build these kinds of ecosystems? And what we've tried to do is try to build the initiative and experimentation that we see through all of our programs at the Trust Center, at Delta V, at various programs around campus, at Innovation HQ. And what we try to do is kind of say, how can we understand what the impact of those programs have been on building the kind of inclusive, innovation-driven entrepreneurship that I think is a hallmark of the kind of economy we're building here. So I recognize I'm over time. So the core question, how can building, seeing the ecosystem impact our ability to grow that MIT ecosystem? Thank you so very much.